Good day, dear listeners. It is Maya again, and I am truly glad you are here with me today to listen to a story that still feels absolute unbelievable, even to me, the woman who lived through it. Before we dive into the impossible details, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and like this video, but only if you genuinely find yourself captivated by the journey I am about to share. And also, please let me know in the comments section below which specific city and country you are listening from. That way, I can see just how far my incredible story has traveled across the globe. People constantly ask me, with a mixture of disbelief and awe, how on earth I ended up buying a grand historical house for a single $100 bill at a state auction. The answer is painfully simple, and I assure you it was not glamorous in the slightest. The truth is, I was completely broke, I was utterly desperate, and I had absolutely nothing left in this world to lose. My name is Olivia Sterling. I am 34 years old, and exactly 2 years ago, I was barely surviving in a cramped, damp studio apartment in the darkest part of Philadelphia. Sleeping on a stained mattress I had bought secondhand from a shady online listing, and eating peanut butter straight out of the jar because it was cheaper than buying a loaf of bread to make actual sandwiches. I had spent 6 grueling years building a boutique landscape architecture and garden design business from the ground up with my college roommate, Chloe Albright. But when Chloe quietly, maliciously dissolved our entire LLC one afternoon and walked away with our extensive client database, all our vendor relationships, and the stellar reputation we had built together, she left me with absolutely nothing. Worst of all, she left me legally gagged by a strict non-compete clause that she had her high-priced lawyer sneakily draft the exact week before she pulled the plug on my life. I didn't have a single dime to fight her legally, so I simply didn't, forced to accept my defeat while my family back in Pittsburgh kept begging me to move back home, and my sister relentlessly sent me job listings for entry-level administrative assistant positions. But I just kept foolishly telling them I was fine, that I was coping, when the reality was that I was drowning. I stumbled onto the concept of municipal tax lien auctions during a blurry, insomniac YouTube rabbit hole session at 2 o'clock in the morning. Municipalities across the country are forced to sell properties when the original owners stop paying their required taxes. And while most of those listed properties are completely worthless, hazardous, or too expensive to salvage, the entry cost could be shockingly low if you were willing to take an enormous risk on something truly unwanted: a house burdened with endless legal liens, critical structural problems, complicated title issues, or a dark history that made every other sane bitter. Walk away. The forgotten property at 712 Blackwood Lane in Oak Haven, a small, decaying town 40 minutes outside of Philadelphia, possessed all of those terrifying things. It was a sprawling, grand, 4-bedroom historical house built in 1905, last officially occupied in 2019 when the eccentric owner, an elderly man named Arthur Pendleton, had died alone in his bed without a legal will and without a single heir anyone in the county could locate. The local municipality had been desperately sitting on this colossal eyesore for 2 long years, unable to sell it or manage the decaying structure. The minimum mandated bid was set at a single $100, and on the terrifying morning of the public auction, I was the absolute only person on the entire property who bothered to place a bid. I drove my battered, aging truck out to see the house that very same afternoon, the tires crunching loudly on the overgrown gravel driveway, and it was the peak of October. The towering ancient maple trees along Blackwood Lane were burning an intense orange and deep red in the fading sunlight, which was, quite frankly, the absolute only beautiful thing I could say about the entire situation I was stepping into. The house itself was a complete architectural disaster, a terrifying monument to neglect. The grand wrapping front porch railing had completely rotted clean through in multiple sections. One of the main front parlor windows was boarded over with thick, warped plywood that had started to peel, and the massive front yard was a treacherous tangle of dead, thorny weeds and wild, volunteer sumac bushes that had grown shoulder-high against the shifting stone foundation. But even amidst the ruin, my professional designers, I could see it the way you can sometimes see incredible, raw potential in a broken person who has been through something devastatingly hard. The massive roof line was mostly straight, The colossal chimney structure was still intact, and the grand front porch columns were original, thick, and surprisingly solid. I bravely walked through every single empty, echoing room with a flickering flashlight in one hand and a blank notepad in the other, methodically inventorying the damage. And by the time I stepped back outside into the freezing October night air, I had already stubbornly decided that I was going to fix this wreck of a house all by myself. I had done enough extensive renovation and design work through my dissolved business to know exactly what I was doing structurally, so I made a practical, if slightly insane, plan. I would live inside the dilapidated house while I worked on it, camping out in one salvageable room at a time, and I would sell it for a life-changing profit when it was finally complete. The first few weeks of being a homeowner were exactly what I expected them to be: exhausting, filthy, and deeply unglamorous. I tore out the crumbling bathroom tile with a crowbar and discovered a horrifying, soft subfloor that had been waterlogged for a decade. I pulled down the ancient, greasy kitchen cabinets and found an antique layer of expensive wallpaper under the drywall, and beneath that the original hand-carved beadboard in near-perfect condition. I spent a grueling weekend replacing the porch railing, reglazed 2 massive windows with shaking hands, and sacrificed an entire, freezing weekend cleaning a full century's worth of filthy debris and hidden trash from the dark, damp basement. But in the middle of the 3rd exhausting week, I first started to notice that something was very, fundamentally off about the architecture. I was working on the far wall of the formal dining room, the very long interior wall that ran perfectly parallel to the main hallway, when I casually tapped it with my knuckle the way I always do to test for hollow spots that might indicate critical water damage or a hidden, failing wall stud. The left side of the wall sounded solid, deep, and precisely the way it was supposed to sound in a well-built house. I moved my hand and tapped the right side of the wall, and it echoed the exact same solid, reassuring tone. But there was a specific rectangular section in the absolute middle of that wall, roughly 4 feet wide, that sounded entirely different to my experienced ear. It didn't sound hollow like I might have expected if there were a hidden void or a failing repair, but rather it sounded more muffled, dense, and insulated, as if there was something heavy or carefully packed in behind it. I desperately told myself that it was probably just extra insulation that some cautious homeowner had added at some point over the last century, because old houses were notoriously full of those quirks, as people often did strange, inexplicable things to historical properties. I tried my hardest to tell myself that practical lie for 3 more full days as I continued painting the room. But my brain refused to let the sound go, so I finally got out my electronic stud finder, ran it slowly across that specific section of the dining room wall, and watched the readings jump and flash in a dangerous pattern that didn't match insulation at all. The sensor was indicating consistent, solid density, broken up by a visible, perfectly rectangular seam that stood approximately 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide on the left side, a door-shaped seam that had been seamlessly covered up and painted over years ago. I slowly put the stud finder down, walked back out to my truck in the front driveway, and sat in the freezing cold for a very long time, staring at the front of the house through the windshield while my mind raced with terrifying possibilities. The maple tree in the front yard had dropped almost all of its leaves by then, leaving them plastered wet and heavy against the peeling paint of the front porch steps, making the house look even more foreboding than usual. What on earth was behind that deliberately sealed wall? And why had someone spent so much time and effort to hide it? A massive part of me genuinely did not want to know the answer, because some deep primal part of my gut understood, long before my logical brain could process it, that whatever was waiting back there was going to fundamentally change absolutely everything about my life, and I had already been through so many devastating changes that year that I wasn't sure I could survive another one. But I forced myself to unbuckle my seatbelt, climb out of the truck, and walk back inside those echoing rooms, picking up my heavy metal pry bar from the kitchen counter and taking a deep, shuddering breath. I walked back to the dining room, located the top edge of that almost invisible, painted-over seam, and without another second of hesitation, I forcefully jammed the pry bar into the crack and broke the seal on the wall, and my life as I knew it was permanently over. The small room behind that wall was incredibly tiny, perhaps 8 feet wide by 6 feet deep, but it was pristine, smelling heavily of old cedar wood and something curiously metallic, almost like ancient coins. There was a single, bare, low-wattage light bulb hanging directly overhead, connected to a dedicated wire that I could trace running back into the house's main electrical system, which meant that someone, likely the mysterious Gerald Foss, Arthur Pendleton, had wired this room deliberately and carefully. The concrete floor of the small room was swept perfectly clean and stacked neatly against the far wall in 12 identical, heavy black military-style duffel bags was more raw, physical cash than I had ever seen in my entire life, even in movies. I didn't bother counting it that night. I simply couldn't process the visual information in front of me, so I just collapsed and sat on the cold concrete floor of that tiny, hidden room with my back against the metal door frame, my heart pounding at a terrifying pace that wasn't healthy, and I stared blankly at the stacked black bags for what felt like hours. It was only when I finally forced myself to stand back up, forced myself to take a single deep breath, and forced my eyes to actively look around the rest of the small room, searching for any other hidden details, that I finally saw the simple white envelope. It was resting on a small, hand-built wooden shelf mounted to the right-hand wall at perfect eye level. A plain, cheap, white paper envelope sealed with a thick dollop of old wax, with absolutely nothing written on the outside to indicate its contents, and my name was certainly not on it. There was no name listed at all. My hands are shaking so violently that I nearly dropped it when I broke the ancient wax seal and reached inside, pulling out a single, generic white index card. On the card, written in neat, careful, all-capital handwriting using a thick black pen, was one single, terrifying word, and that word was run. I did not run. I want to be absolutely clear about that decision, because in the terrifying days and weeks that immediately followed, I would ask myself 100 separate times in my own head why on earth I hadn't just listed the house back for auction and fled. The honest answer I always came back to was the exact same rational calculation. Running requires knowing exactly what you are running from, and at that moment, I knew nothing about the context of this hidden fortune. What I had in my physical possession was a legally bought room full of cash, one single, ominous word written on a piece of paper, and a grand house I had legally purchased for $100 from the government. Running felt like cowardly surrendering something life-changing that I hadn't even had the chance to understand or fight for yet. But I certainly did not sleep a single second that entire night either. I furiously locked the hidden wall panel back up as best I could from the outside, carefully pressing the cut section back into its original place and propping it securely with a heavy length of construction 2x4 before the sun came up, just in case someone came looking for it. And then I sat at the messy, sawdust-covered kitchen table with a full cup of black coffee that I didn't drink, watching the dark window lighten from black to a deep gray to the cold, flat white of a typical dreary November morning. I spent the next 24 hours mentally cataloging absolutely everything I actually knew about Arthur Pendleton, which was fundamentally almost nothing of substance. All I knew from the auction paperwork was that he had died in his bed in 2019, that he had lived entirely alone in this massive house for at least the last 20 or 30 years, and that he had 0 heirs the entire county could find, regardless of how hard they tried. That was the complete, exhaustive inventory of facts I possessed about the mysterious, dead man whose massive house I was currently living in. What I did the very next morning was drive to the Oak Haven Public Library, not to the county courthouse, not to a lawyer's office, and definitely not to the police, but to the library. I knew I wasn't ready to be official about any of this yet, because I desperately needed to think before I acted, and critical thinking always required information. The head librarian, a very small, precise, older woman named Mrs. Garvey, was incredibly helpful and didn't ask a single intrusive or curious question about my research, which I appreciated more than I could possibly say. She helped me pull the entire digital newspaper archive for the Oak Haven Courier from the last 15 years, and I spent the next 4 hours glued to a microfiche reader, painstakingly going through every single issue. Gerald Foss, Arthur Pendleton's name, appeared in the local newspaper exactly twice over that entire 15-year period, once in 2003, as a brief mention in a county planning commission public notice about a controversial zoning variance for a large property on Route 9, a property officially listed under a generic shell company called Pendleton Land Holdings, LLC. His name appeared a second time in 2017 inside an obituary for an elderly man named Douglas Crane, who is described as a long-time, respected resident of Oak Haven and a former, successful business partner of Arthur Pendleton. I wrote Douglas Crane's name down and circled it, and I also meticulously wrote down the name of the attorney officially listed on that 2003 zoning notice, a man named Martin Hale of Hale and Associates, with a law firm address in Grayfield, the county seat. I drove home late that evening in the absolute darkness, parked my truck in the driveway, and sat there for long while looking at the front of the house before mustering the courage to go inside, because the house looked fundamentally different to me now. Not threatening exactly, but incredibly weighted, like a quiet person who is desperately keeping a life-or-death secret and can't quite hide the agonizing fact that they're doing it. The very next morning, I officially counted the money, and the agonizing process took me the entire grueling day because I was incredibly careful and methodical about it, the way I am always careful and methodical about everything I do when I am genuinely terrified for my life. Precision and repetitive tasks are the absolute closest things I know to maintaining physical control over my own body when my world is spinning out of orbit. So I sat at my dusty kitchen table, unzipped every single identical black duffel bag one by one, and began stacking the thousands of worn, banded bills in massive denominations, meticulously counting each towering stack twice to ensure I wasn't losing my mind. When I finally finished the exhausting inventory as the sun began to set behind the bare maple trees outside, the grand total sitting on my cheap, sawdust-covered table was exactly $3,100,000, and I sat in the dim, fading light with that impossible number echoing in my head for a very long time. $3.1 million in untraceable cash, hidden secretly inside a sealed wall in a decaying historical house that I had legally purchased for a single $100 bill from a dead man who had absolutely no living heirs. Sold by a county government that had absolutely no idea what was lurking inside the architecture. Legally speaking, I knew the entire situation was incredibly murky in a way that was going to require terrifyingly careful navigation. Because while the physical house was undeniably mine, what was hidden inside the house was also arguably mine. But that dangerous argument heavily depended on exactly where the money originally came from, how it had gotten there, and whether anyone with a violent legal or illegal claim to it was still alive to come knocking on my door. The blank white envelope contained the single warning to run, which meant someone had actively put that staggering amount of money there deliberately, which also meant someone had known at some point that another person might eventually tear that wall down and find it. And money of this immense magnitude always had a dark history deeply attached to it. The immediate, burning question was who was attached to it, and I knew right then that I needed an elite lawyer. Absolutely not the suspicious Martin Hale from the zoning notice, because he had a direct prior connection to Arthur Pendleton, and I wasn't going anywhere near anyone with a history to this property until I thoroughly understood what I was dealing with. I needed a brilliant legal mind completely outside of Oak Haven County, someone I could trust implicitly, and I also knew I needed to be exceptionally careful about what I said, to whom I said it, and for exactly how long I kept my mouth shut, because the exact moment I told anyone, a lawyer, a local friend, my mother, or the police, this terrifying situation would become a permanent reality that could never be undone. I bravely gave myself 3 quiet, solitary days to relentlessly research, to critically think, and to build a bulletproof plan before I made a single, official move, deciding to establish a clear legal record of the discovery with photographs and timestamps to protect myself, to research the origin of the money to anticipate who might come looking for it, and to consult an attorney who specialized in found property before saying a single word to the local authorities. What I tragically did not account for during those 3 quiet days of strategic planning was the chilling reality that someone was already actively watching the house from the shadows, though I wouldn't discover that horrifying fact until it was almost too late. The brilliant lawyer I finally found was named Penelope Vance, an elite attorney who practiced out of a highly secure, private firm in downtown Philadelphia, specializing heavily in complex estate disputes, obscure probate complications, and what her expensive website intriguingly called property law for non-standard situations, which perfectly described my waking nightmare. I called her secure office line on a Thursday morning from the cab of my truck, deliberately parked 2 blocks away from the decaying house because I had begun to feel, irrationally I told myself, that the very walls of the property were actively listening to my every breath, and I proceeded to tell her absolutely everything. I told her about the desperate tax lien auction, the laughably low purchase price, the hidden cedar room, the $3 million in duffel bags, and the ominous, wax-sealed envelope containing the terrifying warning, speaking continuously for 20 straight minutes, without taking a single breath. When I finally finished my frantic explanation, there was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line before Penelope asked me a question I completely didn't expect. She simply asked if I was physically safe right now, and when I stammered that I thought I was, she firmly ordered me not to touch the money, not to tell another living soul, and to be sitting in her downtown office the very next morning. Penelope Vance was a sharp, fiercely intelligent woman in her late 40s with an undeniable reputation for being the exact person other corporate lawyers sent their cases to when the details were far too dangerous or legally complicated for them to want to touch. And she listened to me tell the entire story again in her plush office, taking meticulous notes on a legal pad before leaning back in her chair with the focused expression of a surgeon doing rapid treat. She explained with brutal honesty that the legal status of the money was genuinely uncertain, because while I had purchased the property through a completely legitimate tax lien auction, giving me a massive argument for ownership of its contents if the cash was obtained illegally as the proceeds of a massive criminal enterprise, the federal government could forcefully make a claim, and so could any surviving victims of whatever dark activity generated it in the first place. She sternly advised me to file a formal, documented report with the Oak Haven County Sheriff's Office immediately, not because I was legally required to surrender the funds in this precise circumstance, but because creating an official, time-stamped police record of the discovery was the single best armor I had. If a dangerous criminal ever claimed that I found their stolen money and was trying to hide it, I needed an ironclad paper trail, proving I went straight to the authorities the exact moment I formulated a safe plan. I bravely filed that massive report the very same afternoon at the local sheriff's station, and within an hour I was sitting directly across from Sheriff Marcus Thorne, a heavy, seasoned man in his late 50s with a measured, observing quality to his attention that I found oddly reassuring as he took my unbelievable claim incredibly seriously. He personally drove back to the Dunmore Street house with me, meticulously documented the hidden cedar room, heavily photographed the 12 duffel bags, and logged the serial numbers on a massive sample of the $100 bills before he stood up and said something that completely stopped the blood flowing in my veins. He looked around the small space and casually mentioned that the department had actually received a highly anonymous tip regarding this exact address back in 2018, with a caller claiming that a massive sum of illicit money was being stored here. But when they followed up and searched the property, they found absolutely nothing and closed the file, which meant that someone who knew Arthur Pendleton's secrets had actively tried to have the money confiscated a full year before he died, and they had ultimately failed to find the secret wall. I drove my truck home that evening with the windows rolled completely down, even though the November air was freezing, because I desperately needed the sharp wind hitting my face to keep me from completely losing my mind with paranoia. I was still sitting in the dark driveway, my hands gripping the steering wheel, when my cell phone suddenly buzzed violently in my pocket with a text message from a local number I completely didn't recognize, and the chilling words on the screen simply read, "We know you found it. Do not do anything stupid." I instantly screenshot the horrifying threat, securely forwarded it directly to Penelope, and immediately called Sheriff Thorne, locking all the doors to my truck while I waited for his instructions, completely terrified that the anonymous sender was watching me from the dark tree line at that very second. The next morning, Penelope called me back with massive, game-changing news. She had utilized a highly placed contact at the county recorder's office and had successfully pulled the full, obscured chain of title on the Pendleton land holding shell company from the ancient zoning notice I had found at the public library. The shadowy company had been officially registered in 2001, and it only had two listed legal members, Arthur Pendleton and a prominent local man named Raymond Crane, the wealthy, surviving son of Douglas Crane, the man whose obituary had explicitly mentioned Arthur as his former business partner. I finally had my very first direct, undeniable connection. I had my first real piece of actionable evidence, and someone dangerous out there knew exactly what I had discovered, meaning there was absolutely no going back to my quiet life now. Penelope moved with terrifying legal speed the moment we secured Raymond Crane's name, filing an emergency federal injunction the following morning requesting that the $3 million be removed from the house and held under strict court supervision pending a final resolution of the ownership claim, while simultaneously notifying the furious county prosecutor's office of the threatening burner phone text message. I spent those agonizingly tense days hiding out at Penelope's secure downtown office or sleeping in a cheap, anonymous motel miles away from the decaying house, as she had sternly advised me to completely abandon the property until we had a much clearer sense of exactly who we were dealing with. And I agreed without a single argument because I was not a reckless woman. Raymond Crane was a 47-year-old, highly influential commercial real estate developer based in the county seat, and Penelope's aggressive research quickly turned up a massive pattern of shell company registrations, sudden corporate dissolutions, and shady out-of-court settlements that screamed to anyone paying attention that he was a man incredibly comfortable with the dark architecture of obscured, illegal ownership. Crucially, his personal defense lawyer was none other than Martin Hale, the exact same slick attorney who had appeared in the 2003 zoning notice connected to the hidden shell company, completely validating my raw instinct to entirely avoid his firm in the beginning. Penelope laid out our working theory one rainy afternoon over bad coffee in her conference room, explaining that Arthur Pendleton and Douglas Crane had clearly run an illegal enterprise together that generated massive amounts of physical cash that couldn't easily be deposited into traditional banks, forcing them to build the hidden vault. When Douglas Crane suddenly died in 2017, his arrogant son Raymond would have fully expected to instantly inherit his father's massive share of whatever dark arrangement they had built. But if Arthur had aggressively stonewalled him, refusing to acknowledge the illegal partnership or hand over a single dime, Raymond would have been completely legally stuck, unable to file a formal lawsuit claiming ownership of money he couldn't legally explain to the IRS. In a desperate act of revenge, Raymond must have called in the anonymous police tip in 2018, hoping to trigger a massive police seizure after which he could potentially make a shady claim as an interested party. But Arthur had hidden the room far too well, and when Arthur died alone in 2019, the massive property went into a long legal limbo, leaving Raymond furiously waiting for years for a chance to finally buy the house himself, until a desperate, broke woman named Olivia Sterling showed up at the municipal auction and bought his $3 million for a single $100 bill. That very same evening, as I sat alone in my locked motel room, my burner phone rang with an unknown number, and because Penelope had explicitly ordered me to legally record and document every single contact, I pressed the record button and answered the line in absolute silence. The voice on the other end was incredibly smooth, deeply deliberate, and dripped with the terrifying composure of a wealthy man who was incredibly used to choosing his words very carefully to avoid wiretaps. "Ms. Sterling," the voice murmured softly, "my name is Raymond Crane, and I strongly believe that we should sit down and talk like reasonable adults. That money belonged to my late father's business partner, and there is a private, legally binding agreement that explicitly entitles my family to exactly half of the vault." I completely refused to say a single word, my heart hammering in my throat as he continued his smooth, manipulative speech, claiming he wasn't asking for anything that wasn't rightfully his and begging me to be reasonable before things escalated out of our control. "Call my attorney," I finally snapped, my voice shaking with rage, and I instantly hung up the phone, forwarded the recording directly to Penelope, and sat on the edge of the cheap motel mattress, letting my entire body shake violently for exactly 5 minutes before I forced myself to get back to work. Penelope called me back within the hour, her voice sharp and calculating, warning me that Raymond was absolutely going to escalate his tactics because he had zero legitimate legal claims that he could safely bring into a public courtroom without exposing his own family's criminal enterprise, which meant he was going to try far more dangerous physical methods to intimidate me into handing over the cash. She was entirely right because exactly 3 days later, I cautiously drove back to the house during broad daylight to collect the last of my expensive design tools, only to find the heavy rear kitchen door standing wide open, its deadbolt completely shattered from the outside. Nothing of obvious financial value was taken, and the hidden cedar room had already been entirely emptied and resealed under court order by the sheriff. But someone had meticulously gone through absolutely all of my personal things. My design notes, my renovation files, and the heavy folder containing all of my property purchase documents had been violently dumped onto the floor. They were desperately searching for something specific, something they urgently needed to counter my legal ownership claim. So I immediately called the sheriff, called Penelope, heavily photographed the entire crime scene, and then drove to a bright, crowded diner on Route 9, ordering a massive coffee because I desperately needed to think about what Raymond Crane was willing to risk breaking and entering for. The terrifying answer finally came to me slowly, the way profound answers sometimes do when you are incredibly exhausted, deeply frightened, and sitting alone in a diner booth watching the highway traffic blur past. He needed to know with absolute certainty if I had found the private partnership agreement he had mentioned on the phone, the physical document that proved his father owned half the money. If that paper actually existed, and if I had accidentally found it hidden somewhere inside that massive house, it could completely cut both ways. It could either legally support his shady claim to the cash, or it could catastrophically expose exactly what their dark business had actually been to the federal government. I didn't actually have the document, but I now knew exactly what I needed to look for, so I gave myself 3 more days of hiding in the motel to let the adrenaline leave my system, watching old movies and eating cheap delivered pizza, until my mind was sharp enough to go back to war. When the 3 days were up, Raymond Crane had gone entirely still. There were no more anonymous calls, no more threatening texts from burner numbers, and no more signs of violent entry at the property. But Penelope had warned me that this specific kind of absolute stillness was often far more deliberate and dangerous than the noise. A powerful, connected man like Raymond, heavily advised by a slick lawyer like Martin Hale, would strategically pull back and calculate his next move rather than continue blindly pressing when his initial intimidation tactics hadn't produced the desired results. They were watching me, waiting for me to make a critical mistake. I used their silence to my absolute advantage, returning to the house on a bright Monday morning with fresh eyes and a completely new, obsessive purpose. I was no longer just renovating the architecture. I was methodically searching every single inch of the property, room by room, tearing into every single place a piece of paper might have been hidden by an old man careful enough to hide $3 million in a secret wall. I aggressively pulled up heavy floor vents, unscrewed and checked behind every single electrical plate, tore out the ancient drawer liners in the built-in kitchen cabinets, and spent an entire, suffocating morning crawling through the damp basement with a powerful flashlight, searching for a hidden safe or a loose brick. I finally found it on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, buried deep in the sweltering attic, carefully folded inside the fragile cardboard sleeve of an antique jazz vinyl record album that had been casually tucked into a dusty, forgotten box against the north wall. The incredibly fragile document consisted of 4 yellowed pages, meticulously handwritten in heavy black ink, dated all the way back to 2001, and clearly signed at the very bottom by both Arthur Pendleton and Douglas Crane. It was an incredibly detailed, ruthless partnership agreement, and it was entirely specific. The 2 men had operated what they politely called a cash facilitation service, a professional, corporate phrase that, in the terrifying context of everything else, was clearly a blatant description of a massive, regional money laundering operation. Desperate local businesses and shady contractors in the region had paid them an astronomical premium to absorb massive amounts of physical cash generated through unreported, illegal transactions and the two men would seamlessly reintroduce it into the legitimate economy through a dizzying rotation of fake shell entities, of which Pendleton Land Holdings was the primary anchor. The handwritten agreement set out the financial split perfectly: 60% to Arthur, 40% to Douglas, and critically included a massive, ironclad clause specifying that in the event of either party's death, the entire arrangement would instantly dissolve and all remaining assets would permanently revert directly to the surviving partner, completely bypassing any external heirs. That specific clause was the absolute, undeniable kill shot to Raymond Crane's entire legal strategy, because he had absolutely no legal claim under this agreement. His father's share had legally reverted to Arthur when Douglas died in 2017, and with Arthur's subsequent death in 2019, the criminal arrangement had 0 surviving parties. The massive fortune, whatever terrifying legal status it originally carried, had permanently gone with the physical property, meaning it belonged to the woman who bought the house. I sat on the filthy attic floor for a very long time after reading those 4 pages, watching the heavy dust motes move slowly in the pale light coming through the roof vent, feeling the terrifying weight of the criminal conspiracy I was now holding in my shaking hands. I heavily photographed every single page using my cell phone, instantly sent the encrypted files to Penelope, and when I finally called her, she was dead silent for an incredibly long moment before she let out a slow, heavy breath, telling me that this specific document changed the legal picture completely, but it also meant the ruthless district attorney's office was going to be intensely interested in its contents. Penelope explained carefully that there was a highly dangerous, yet possible pathway here. If I cooperated fully with the county prosecutor's massive investigation into the money laundering operation, handing over the document voluntarily, my legal claim to the $3 million as a good faith purchaser of the property would be treated with extreme sympathy by the judge, while completely destroying Raymond Crane. If this document proved what we knew it proved, Raymond had been aggressively attempting to recover dirty money that he had absolutely no legal right to, stolen from a massive criminal enterprise that his own father had built, which meant the prosecutor was going to want to arrest him immediately. I felt a profound, heavy calm settle deep in my chest. It wasn't exactly triumph, because it was far too early and dangerous for celebration, but it was the specific, grounded clarity that comes when you have finally stopped reacting in pure terror to a situation and have actively started shaping its outcome with your own 2 hands. 2 days later, under Penelope's fierce protection, I met with an incredibly sharp assistant district attorney named Claire Montgomery, a highly efficient, no-nonsense woman who asked brilliant questions as I handed over the original partnership agreement, the digital photographs, the recording of Raymond's threatening call, the police documentation of the break-in, and the terrifying text message. She thanked me with a deadly serious expression and told me she would be in touch. And as I walked out of the intimidating county building into the pale November sunlight, I immediately called my old college friend Emma, the only person I trusted enough to tell the truth to, and asked her to drive up from Philadelphia to meet me for dinner because I desperately needed to look into a friendly face. We sat in a quiet, secluded restaurant booth for 3 full hours while I spilled the entire impossible story, not because I needed any legal advice. I had Penelope for that, but because I needed someone who loved me to tell me I wasn't completely losing my mind. And when she finally looked at me across the table and told me I was the most terrifyingly competent person she had ever met, I genuinely laughed for the first time in months. They finally came for me at the house on a quiet Saturday morning, exactly as Penelope had predicted they would when the legal walls started closing in around them. I was there, covered in plaster dust, because I had boldly moved back in 2 weeks earlier once Penelope explicitly confirmed that the federal court injunction was holding strong and the money had been formally locked away in a supervised government escrow account. Life, in its incredibly mundane, resilient way, had somewhat reasserted itself alongside the sheer terror of the situation, and I was actively continuing the renovations, still retiling the master bathroom, still aggressively refinishing the dark dining room floors, and still obsessing over cabinet hardware, because physical labor was the absolute only thing that reliably organized my racing thoughts. The heavy knock at the front door came exactly at 9:30, and when I looked through the dusty front window, I saw two people standing stiffly on my porch. Raymond Crane, looking incredibly tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit, and projecting the careful, terrifying composure of a man who had extensively rehearsed this exact interaction, and an older woman I didn't recognize, perhaps in her early 60s, with a rigid, aristocratic posture and a deeply practiced expression of maternal concern. I slowly opened the heavy front door, keeping my hand firmly on the brass handle, but I absolutely did not invite them inside my home, staring at them with completely blank, unapologetic eyes. Raymond offered a smooth, completely hollow apology for coming unannounced, formally introducing the older woman as his Aunt Gloria Crane, claiming she was incredibly close to his late father and that they had driven out here in person because they desperately wanted to clear the air and resolve what they were calling a massive misunderstanding between our families. Gloria immediately deployed a look of profound, practiced sorrow, placing her hand over her heart and telling me in a trembling voice that her beloved brother would be absolutely heartbroken to know this financial dispute had become so horribly adversarial, casually dropping the lie that Douglas and Arthur were just dear, innocent friends. I completely refused to say a single word in response, staring at them blankly, because I had quickly learned over the past month that absolute, unrelenting silence in aggressive conversations like this was far more terrifying and powerful than any argument I could possibly make. Raymond's voice smoothly shifted into something just short of desperate reason, claiming that his father had put years of his life into that business, that the massive amount of money hidden in my walls was the direct result of his family's blood and sweat. And while he completely understood that the legal situation was incredibly complicated for everyone, he begged me to look at it morally, spreading his manicured hands in a gesture of fake, appealing openness. There it was, the word morally, the exact word that desperate, guilty people always use when they know they absolutely cannot use the word legally to get what they want. Gloria stepped slightly forward, completely dropping the sorrowful act and taking on the arrogant air of someone offering a magnificent concession to a peasant, quietly proposing that they weren't actually looking to take all of the millions, just a completely private, untraceable arrangement where I would hand over exactly 1/3 of the cash. She promised that if I agreed, there would be no more exhausting legal proceedings, no more stress for either side. I could keep the beautiful house, I could keep the majority of the fortune, and we could all simply walk away in peace. I looked at both of them for an incredibly long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable for them. And then I finally spoke, my voice coming out far steadier and colder than I could have ever imagined. "Do you know what I actually find morally interesting?" I asked, staring directly into Raymond's eyes. "I find it fascinating that you are standing on my private property, making this illegal offer during the exact same week that your slick attorney formally filed a desperate motion to have the handwritten partnership agreement excluded from criminal evidence on the grounds of attorney-client privilege." The deeply rehearsed, arrogant composure on Raymond's face violently flickered for a fraction of a second, his jaw clenching as he tried to stammer that those were completely separate legal matters. But I instantly cut him off, telling him that if he genuinely believed he had any moral or legal claim to that money, he would be making his arguments in front of a federal judge, not begging a stranger on a porch. I told him he was only here because his expensive lawyers had firmly advised him that his legal strategy was entirely doomed, and I absolutely was not interested in entertaining dark, private arrangements designed to accomplish what his failing legal team couldn't. Gloria's fake sorrow instantly curdled into something incredibly sharp and venomous, her true nature completely exposing itself as she stepped closer to the door, warning me in a terrifying whisper that I was making a massive mistake, claiming that Raymond had powerful friends in this county, people who had known their family for decades, and that I was just a completely vulnerable stranger. And strangers who aggressively make enemies of the wrong people often regret it. Raymond quickly snapped at her to stop talking, but the carefully crafted mask had completely slipped from their faces, and we all knew exactly what had just been threatened. So I simply looked at them and firmly commanded them to leave my property immediately. Raymond stared at me for an incredibly long moment with an expression I instantly recognized. It wasn't quite hot anger, but something buried deep underneath it, something infinitely colder and more dangerous. Before he simply nodded once, turned on his heel, and escorted his aunt back to their silver luxury sedan, driving away into the morning mist. I securely locked the heavy front door and stood in the silent hallway for a full minute, my heart racing wildly in my chest. But my hands were completely steady. I had expected them to come. I had even anticipated the emotional manipulation and the fake compromise. But what I hadn't fully expected was how incredibly transparent their desperation would feel to me. I immediately called Penelope and relayed every single word of the conversation, specifically highlighting Gloria's chilling threat about making enemies of the wrong people, and Penelope's voice actually lit up with intense legal satisfaction, telling me that an implicit, documented threat delivered directly on my doorstep was exactly the kind of reckless behavior that proves to a prosecutor that this is a dangerous criminal family applying illegal pressure, not a sympathetic group of heirs. The massive, final hearing was officially scheduled for a dreary Thursday in mid-December. And by then, the relentless prosecutor's investigation had been running at full speed for 6 weeks, completely tearing apart the Crane family's history. ADA Claire Montgomery had officially filed a brutal criminal referral against Raymond Crane for felony harassment and witness intimidation based entirely on the burner text message, the recorded phone call, and Gloria's terrifying statement on my porch, while Martin Hale's desperate motion to exclude the partnership agreement had been entirely denied by the judge. The forensic accountant retained by the state had spent 4 grueling weeks actively tracing the serial numbers on the physical bills, and the results were devastating. While some of the cash traced back to legitimate local business transactions, massive portions of it traced directly back to structured deposits associated with known, violent illegal enterprises, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the money was incredibly dirty. I sat in the packed hearing room wearing a sharp charcoal blazer I had bought secondhand, and I was completely, terrifyingly calm, feeling the grounded peace that only comes from having done absolutely everything in your power to prepare for war. Raymond sat perfectly still on the other side of the room beside Martin Hale, dressed impeccably, wearing the arrogant expression of a powerful man who believes he is completely untouchable, but his armor was about to be permanently shattered. ADA Montgomery methodically walked the stunned judge through the entire timeline, presenting the partnership agreement, the forensic accounting, and then she introduced a devastating surprise, testimony from a retired restaurant owner named Frank Rossi, who had agreed under full immunity to completely expose the cash facilitation service, naming Douglas Crane as his primary criminal contact and Martin Hale as the shady attorney who drafted the illegal shell companies. When Montgomery casually mentioned that they had a second, completely separate witness who possessed direct documentation proving Raymond had personally received an $80,000 distribution from the illegal enterprise in 2015, the arrogant composure on Raymond's face completely broke, his eyes widening in absolute, undeniable terror. The judge immediately stopped the proceedings, looking directly at Martin Hale, and coldly announced that he was directing the State Bar Association to heavily investigate Hale's firm for massive ethical violations and conflicts of interest, completely destroying the lawyer's career in front of the entire courtroom, while Raymond stared straight ahead, his empire crumbling into dust. The months following the explosive hearing moved with the relentless, crushing speed of the legal system, ending with Raymond Crane completely surrendering and pleading guilty to felony criminal receiving of illegal proceeds, resulting in a massive $200,000 fine, the complete dissolution of his real estate company, and the permanent destruction of his reputation in the county. The final civil proceeding regarding the $3 million was officially resolved in late May, and the judge's incredible determination changed the entire trajectory of my life forever. The specific portion of the money that had been undeniably traced to illegal sources, approximately $900,000, was subjected to civil forfeiture and seized by the state, but the remaining $2.2 million, which could not be connected to traceable criminal activity, was legally declared to belong entirely to me as the lawful, good faith purchaser of the property. I had to read that final legal document 3 separate times while sitting in my truck in the parking lot outside Penelope's office before the reality actually hit me. $2.2 million was permanently, legally mine, completely free and clear of any criminal ties or family claims. I finished the massive renovation of the historical house on Blackwood Lane the following October, exactly 1 year after I had first tapped that hollow dining room wall. But I absolutely did not sell the property like I had originally planned, because somewhere during the endless months of tearing it down to its bones and putting it back together, the house had become my true home. The terrifying hidden cedar room was completely gone, beautifully opened up into the formal dining room to create a stunning, massive space, and I had salvaged the fragrant cedar wood to build a custom floating shelf in my kitchen, which I quietly smiled at every single morning while I drank my coffee. I used a portion of the massive settlement to officially launch my new, completely independent business, Sterling Design, building an incredible roster of high-end clients entirely on my own terms, and I quietly paid off my mother's entire mortgage in Pittsburgh, letting her cry tears of sheer joy over the phone. As I sat on my beautifully restored front porch one crisp autumn evening, watching the maple leaves turn a brilliant orange in the fading sunlight, I thought about Arthur Pendleton's final warning, the single word run, and I realized he didn't mean to literally flee the house. He meant to run away from the overwhelming greed that had completely trapped and destroyed him. I hadn't run from the money, but I also hadn't let absolute terror dictate my actions. I had methodically documented the truth, trusted the right, brilliant people, and stood my ground against incredibly powerful monsters who thought they could crush a desperate woman.